Hello world of YouTube. What do we think about the haircut? What do we think about the vibes? Let me know.
Seriously, shout out to Rachel. I think she did a great job.
And welcome to a video that has been put off for a couple of years and should probably be put off until I watch a couple of essential movies within the realms of this subject. But I say fuck that and welcome you to a list of my 10 favorite horror movies.
Sequels, or 10 other favorite horror movie sequels.
Because you guys know my favorite horror sequel. It's Evil Dead 2. This movie is incredible. It's one of my favorite horror movies of all time. But I still wanted to talk about horror sequels by and large because, I mean, similar to Evil Dead 2, good sequels do a good job at accomplishing its mission statement successfully, whether it's to expand the world, first introduced in the first iteration, explore the antagonist more, and show either their origins or more facets of their personality. It can even be a tangential thing all its own within the same franchise. Horror sequels could be a multitude of things, and in some instances, kind of get swept under the rug under the general feeling that all horror sequels are bad. There's some genuinely great horror movies that I think are kind of underrated as well, and I'm going to use today to kind of talk about 10 other of my favorite horror movie sequels that aren't Evil Dead 2. So it starts at number 11, and it's going to go to my second favorite.
Now, there's going to be some talk as to why these two movies may not be showing up on this list, and it's because even though their respective threats are still colossally scary, these are more action-centric, quotable movies than the ones preceding them. I don't even really consider the first Terminator an outright horror movie. Like, yes, it is scary to think about this giant robot that's on its way to kill you, but it's I don't consider it as much a horror movie as much as Alien is, obviously, and I love these two movies, but I don't consider them horror sequels outright in the same vein as the stuff that's on this list.
Let's go ahead, talk about them. I've got some honorable mentions listed down in the description because even in recent years we've got some horror sequels that I think are pretty amicable while also setting trends that are continued to be explored for better and worse within horror now. Case in point of a sequel that is actually really solid, getting swept under the broad net of all movie sequels are bad or all late movie sequels are bad. Paranormal Activity the Mark Ones is, I would argue, the best sequel in a series that I felt like quickly ran out of ideas incredibly fast. I feel like the idea of telling a side story in this universe that fleshes out aspects of the demon and the curse and the idea of these marked ones isn't a bad concept that I think doesn't get executed all that poorly, and I think that the injections of like this pseudo coming of age ideas into the ring also introduce an element to the story that I think is neat, while also having some of the most batshit moments that the series has ever had in its last like 30 minutes. This movie goes places that are fucking insane, like peak sequel insanity that I love to see and act as what I would argue one of the most underrated side movies in like a well-established horror movie franchise. Sure, it's still got some of the trappings scene and some of the pitfalls seen in movies like this. Some of the scares are kind of cheap, but none of that matters because this movie just builds to this fucking insane moment. Now, if you guys caught my favorite horror movies video, 28 Days Later is on there, and I've kind of gone back and forth with how I feel about 28 Weeks Later. Its sequel that has nothing really to do with the original movie and more is just a continuation of this zombie apocalypse in a way that I should have expected when first watching the movie and didn't necessarily hate at the time, but the issues I'd had with the movie as far as like the rules or the new things explored in the concept of the zombies in this universe, I've grown to like more the more that I sit with this movie. I mean, having it as a part of a two-part collection also kind of helps, but I do enjoy... even when I wasn't the biggest fan of this movie, I enjoyed aspects of it. There were some scenes that I thought were executed fantastically. Its opening especially, I think, is one of the strongest, like, short zombie attack sequences in, like, a zombie horror movie. I think that it's really tense. I think it's well shot. I think that Robert Carlyle sells his fear. And again, outside of that, it does have other good sequences that may not be as good as it, but are really good, tense zombie sequences. I think a lot of the leads in this movie are really strong. I think the kids do a decent job in it. Jeremy Renner, of all people, actually feels really nice in this movie, and there's components that I think work. I still don't like a lot of the directorial artistic choices as much in 28 Weeks Later as much as 28 Days Later. I do think that there are issues that that movie doesn't have that take place in this, as far as, like, again, telling its story and stuff like that. But I think that it's, as far as some of its kills and other dramatic moments, but I still think it's got a lot of good ideas at its core, and it kind of transforms the idea of a zombie into a similar, just, like, ethereal monster a la what kind of Halloween Kills tried to do, but I think executed it far more successfully in 28 Weeks Later.
Oh, yes.
An example of a really good world-building sequel, Saw 2 does a lot of things right. It's got Tobin Bell front and center, who kills it, no pun intended, as Jigsaw. He is great in the role. I love seeing him in this, and I think that he does a really good job playing off of the meltdown that is Donnie Wahlberg in this movie. I love the setting of the trap house tangentially to that. I think that it's a good juxtaposition to the cop drama that is continuing to play out in the interview portion of this movie. I feel like the traps in this movie are even bigger. You know, you got the razor blade wrist trap. You got the needle pit trap, which Shawnee Smith does fantastically as Amanda in that setting. I think that the opening Venus flytrap is also gory as shit in the most tension-building way possible. I think that it's effective in expanding on components that the first movie had while not being bogged down in the pitfalls that are seen in the sequels that come after this. I think that it's a good balance of everything that makes a good Saw movie a good Saw movie. And I think that while it's not the only good sequel in my opinion, it's certainly the best one.
Hellbound. Hellraiser 2.
You know, one of the reasons why Halloween 2 didn't end up on this list, outside of being not as good as the other sequels that came before this in the list, was that Hellraiser 2 exists. It's sort of a better version of what Halloween 2 tried to do, as far as continuing the story from the first, creating a potential endpoint for the figurehead antagonist, while also doing what a good sequel does in expanding on not only the origins of said figurehead antagonist, with Pinhead's origins being the beginning of this movie, also fleshing out the world of Hellraiser by and large by having the hell sequences and the nightmarish, you know, landscapes that are in the back half of this movie, in tandem with being more gory, having even more insane visuals a la what sequels like the Nightmare sequels did, but ramped up even more so. This movie is that bigger, better movie sequel that's talked about in sequels like one that'll be mentioned higher up on this list, while also being just as cool to look at the same time. A lot of the visuals in this movie are insane. You know, the sacrifice on the mattress, you know, the crazy Cenobite shit with Dr. Chenard. Like, this movie does a lot of the same heightened, insane visuals as the first movie, which also just makes it a very fun watch and a good sequel, in my opinion.
Halloween 3, Season of the Witch.
You know, there's a reason why I want to canonize Halloween 3 into the timeline in any way. Because, talking about movies with insane endings, Halloween 3 is a movie that has some moments of shock throughout the build-up to the ending. You know, some of the kills are insane in this movie. Where this movie goes is insane. The entire sequence, once everything reaches the factory, is wild. You know, while some of the acting in that build-up is, you know, a little rough, and that fucking jingle can get a little annoying, it's a movie that's still really fun to watch. and the epitome of a sequel that may not have anything to do with the universe by and large. You know, sure, Halloween, the movie itself, is played in the background in one of the scenes. The movie itself has nothing to do with the series, but I love that it's still attached to this franchise, and I love that it asks the question, what if Michael Myers didn't stick around after the second movie? I like that idea. You know, I always think, like, what if this movie was successful and Halloween instead became an anthology movie? You know what I mean? There's so much potential with that, and I feel like the plot itself is wild and unique, and I think that it's executed fantastically. Now again, it's got at least one sequence that's a little cringe. Scream 2 fulfills on its self-fulfilling prophecy, in that, like Randy Meeks describes it, it's carnage candy. It's more. It's everything you loved from the first one, just done again, but a little differently, and in some instances, very differently and better. I like the backdrop of this movie. I think that it enhances that there is more happening, you know, feel. I feel like some of the kills are insane. Some of the sequences are really tense. I feel like the twist in this movie is even crazier than the twist in the first movie as far as who the killers are. I think that the leads in this movie are as good as the leads in the first movie. I feel like the writing is still as good by and large. I feel like it does a good job at poking fun at horror in the same way that the first movie did, just with sequels. It's what I liked about Scream, just with, sure, at least a couple missteps in some regards that the first movie didn't have, but still retains a lot of what I liked about the first movie. Now, while the original is essentially detached enough that I haven't even seen what it's a sequel to and was the blueprint for the American remake for the most part, it is a well-told anthology piece, essentially, where the house is the anchor in which all of the vignettes are tied to. And I think that it is a well-executed movie with some good slow burn scares, some good tension, some good performances, and some good effects, in my opinion. You know, I feel like for its time especially, this movie is really well made. I think that it's got some good unnerving atmospheres. You know, the death rattle is iconic, and I feel like it's a good version of like a haunted house story. I feel like it's a good gateway movie as well for international horror movies. You know, it was one of my gateways especially, you know, because I had seen the original and then I watched the Japanese version, and I do prefer the Japanese version, but I still like the American remake. You know, I think that it's got good components as well, but I feel like this is a good example of a horror movie that succeeds in atmosphere in tandem with scares. You know, it's not necessarily a sequel in the same vein as everything else that I've talked about outside of Season of the Witch, but I do know from what I know of the movies that came before this, it does retain that world at the very least.
Child's Play 2.
Now, this is the last sequel in the same ilk of like Halloween 2 or Hellraiser 2, where it's more. But I love what Child's Play 2 does in the same way that Saw 2 has Jigsaw front and center. I love that Brad Dourif just gets to shine as Chucky in this movie. I think Alex Vincent is also really good at showing the tragedy of the first movie through the eyes of Andy. I think Christine Elise is great as Kyle, who still gets to be in the franchise to this day. I think that not only does the sequel do a good job at expanding Andy and Chucky's character, it also shows the increase in production value utilized well. I love that they do show off Chucky in this movie, but I think it's in some really fun ways. You know, I love the set pieces in this movie as well. I think the climax of this movie is easily my favorite climax in the entire series. I think that this is a great sequel that, while having this look that feels very separate from the first movie, I think it's good at showcasing the personality behind the creative team of this franchise by and large a little better, and I think that it is an equal parts fun and frightening ride. Another example of a late series sequel actually being fucking awesome. For everything I have positive to say about Final Destination 1 and 2, I admire the fuck out of the creative team behind 5 to make a surprise twist that was not at all necessary in this movie, but feels like a great sort of embodiment of some of what made the first two movies great within what the character that Tony Todd played in those movies sort of tried to cement into the thematics of death and its ever-looming presence. I like the kills in this movie. I think that the premonition scenario, similarly to what happened in, like, 3, especially when it came out for me, but 2 to this day is a really tense moment for me, and it's a kind of a fear of mine. You know, I think that the scenarios that aren't necessarily the kills are also more enjoyable than some of the sequels, because the characters aren't all complete assholes. Sure, some of them are still scum of the earth, and they get their justice via death, but there are some other characters in this that have some good interactions with each other, and I feel like this feels like a good notch above where the franchise was definitely dwelling prior to this movie's release. And again, it's got a twist that is fucking awesome, and I love full stop. Similarly to movies like Halloween 3, it's got some problems, but its climax is fucking worth it in my opinion. Now, while some of the dream sequences from 3 up until this point have some kills that I prefer over some of the kills in New Nightmare, I love that idea-wise, Wes fleshes out some seeds planted here a little more thoughtfully in the Scream series. I like that he gets meta with Freddy of all things. I love that Freddy Krueger gets his own real-world style adventure. I think that there's a level of whimsy in this movie that's similar to the whimsy in Child's Play 2, but through a completely different scope. I feel like the idea of Heather Langenkamp's son being so heavily tied to Freddy is kind of fucked up in a lot of ways, but in a way that fits the character. I like that you get to see Robert Englund in tandem with Freddy Krueger in this movie. I like the scene with Wes Craven as well, the scene where him and Heather Langenkamp are talking. I think that the dreamlike stuff in this movie reaches the same heights that the sequels to without having moments that are quite as cringy. I think that it has a lot of cool ideas at its core, and I like a lot of what this movie has going on, man. You know, for as much as I love Dream Warriors, and it was the last omission I made for this list, I love New Nightmare for what it does to the character of Freddy Krueger and the concepts of what that character could be. You know, something that that the franchise tried to talk about in other sequels, just done so much better in New Nightmare. I like meta stuff, you guys know that, so having a horror movie prior to Scream written by one of the creators of Scream, but to see Wes use Freddy Krueger as a springboard and a point of experimentation and have it go over so well, just aces. I love it, and I'm happy that it exists. And that was my list. Did you like it? Did you not? Let me know your thoughts on it in the comments down below. If you did like it, be sure to give it a like. If you want to see more of my music, gaming, and general nerdery content, be sure to subscribe. Special thanks to my patrons if you want to join the ranks to get early access to content, exclusive content, or to help drive the community. It's linked in the description. I'm going to go, though. Thank you again so very much for watching. I've been Viral Rack. You guys have good days, lives, and situations, and I'll see you another day.